Hey guys, before we get into today's video, I just wanted to let you know that over 90% of you aren't subscribed. If you would please take the time and hit that subscribe button, it means a lot to me, and thank you very much. We'll get into it now. There are some burning questions about history that you might not have learned in school. Some of these could be, why did muskets replace archery? How did vanilla become the standard ice cream flavor? And what's up with Grimm's grisly fairy tales? Stay tuned to find out 22 history facts you didn't learn in school, according to Reddit. Some of you may be asking, where do you go to find surprising facts from history, backed up by solid sources and told with some nuance? You may be shocked to hear that Reddit is the answer. On a subreddit called r/AskHistorians, they specialize in exactly this, with experts writing in-depth answers to questions about any area of history. Some answers can be straightforward, but we often learn that history is more complicated than we thought, and that assumptions we make about the past aren't always correct. So let's take a look at some things you didn't learn in school. Did you know that until 1874, vanilla was a very rare luxury flavor? Even though today we think of vanilla as possibly the plainest flavor, it used to be rare and exotic to people in most parts of the world. The vanilla orchid had to either be grown in its native habitat or hand-pollinated, a process that was invented in the mid-1800s. So why is it in ice cream today? Reddit user Fish09 points out that vanilla was the first luxury flavor to be produced synthetically. It had become cheap enough to use commercially, right in time to catch on the big ice cream boom. By 1900, the United States saw a rapid increase in the sale of both vanilla beans and synthetic vanilla, corresponding to the expanding role of sweet foods in the American life. Technological innovations created the ability to manufacture ice creams, chocolates, and other confectionery items on a large scale at a low price. Both artificial vanilla and vanilla beans priced to continue to decrease throughout the early 20th century. Sugary vanilla-flavored treats had become everyday indulgences due to the wide availability of cheap sugar and artificial vanilla. Why is the heart once considered the source of human emotions? Brains are a bit inside of our skulls, and ancient cultures often didn't fully realize their importance. They knew more often than we sometimes assumed they did, though. Ancient Egyptians studied brain injuries. But why? Then, did they often believe the heart, instead of some other organ, is the seat of emotions or thoughts of the soul? Reddit user Hillsong Hoods traces history of this idea in Europe and calls out a very intuitive reason as to why this might have been. When you're calm, your heart goes ba-boom, ba-boom. When you're not, it goes more like boom-ba, 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 boom. Did you know that duck and cover wasn't actually a bad idea? School children in the 1950s were taught to hide under their desks in case of a nuclear attack. This duck and cover strategy has become a joke since a desk is clearly not going to save you from an atom bomb. But the strategy's origins actually make sense. If you carefully study Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as modeling other nuclear effects, it makes it quite clear that people who are in a medium to light blast area, duck and cover does a great job at reducing burns and injuries. Even for people in a heavy blast area, there are pretty significant mortality differences between people who are taking shelter and people who do not. Your chance of survival might go from 10 to 30% in some zones. For example, does that matter? If you consider that 10% to 30% might be tens or hundreds of thousands of lives, then sure, that matters. But if your benchmark is total survival, then you've misunderstood that campaign, which never promised that. Did you know that ancient Greeks and Romans didn't believe their myths were literally true? Just because we call Greek and Roman mythological figures gods doesn't mean that they were taken seriously. As user Mythopollux points out, our distinctions were between myths and facts, or religious and secular, didn't necessarily exist throughout all Greek and Roman history. To take a few snippets from this answer, whether most people believed into the Iliad, Odyssey, or Aeneid is a bit difficult to say. It is too annoying to just say some of them would, some of them didn't. Did the Romans believe in Tartarus, Cerberus, the river Styx, ferryman Charon, and all that? The real answer is probably yes and no. The Romans simply did not have a consensus on how to explain the afterlife, or only one accepted version. One funerary stone brings to mind, which features separate verses for the dead husband and wife. The husband's verse is much in line with the Euparchian philosophy, saying that he's in a happy state of non-existence, but the wife's epitaph is very much ground weighing heavily on her, while she wanders in the gloomy fields of Hades. Is it possible that the wife and the husband had different outlooks, and they wanted their own ones commemorated on the stone? But the more likely conclusion seems that both belief systems are used as empty, poetic conventions of Roman funerary monuments. Do you know the real reason that baseball became popular? Turns out it might be because of the Civil War. The most popular sports in the U.S. are different from those in any other countries. We play a lot less soccer and a lot more baseball. Reddit user Georgi K. Zoikov writes, "A game very much like the one we know as baseball had a sudden boom after the Civil War because it was a popular one for the Union soldiers to play when they weren't fighting. The New York Knickerbocker rule spread throughout the Union. Either way, though, the answer is the Civil War. It created a wide fan base for the game in a very quick amount of time. Hence why baseball was immediately to field teams all over the country so early, as opposed to a league like the NFL, which was just in the Midwest originally. And by all over the country, I mean north, south, east of the Mississippi. But is that still pretty impressive for the 1870s? There were teams from St. Louis all the way up to Boston. Did you know that before astrology, most people didn't know their birthdays? While calendars and timekeeping were important to many cultures throughout history, they were usually for reasons relating to weather and seasons. It didn't really matter how old you were, and few people would care exactly which day they were born on. User Adarim Hassis on Reddit writes that birthdays didn't really become a popular thing in ancient Persia and Greece until astrology became popular there. So, to answer your question directly, this is the point where more and more people would have been interested in the exact day of their birth. Astrology uses the positions of the planet on the zodiac on the day of your birth, most prominently. So if you wanted to get a horoscope that was accurate to you, you needed to know your exact birthday. I would imagine that there are a lot of people who would make up a day and not be certain, but often the way you would have to know your birthday was what your parents would have your horoscope cast at shortly after you were born. Prior to the democratization away of astrology, I expect you are correct that very few people and any individuals felt the need to keep track of their specific birthday, and would be content only knowing the passage of month and year. Did you know that clowns' distinctive makeup comes from one particular clown? The classic clown stylings that we know today have specific origins. One of these being White-Faced Joey. He's supposed to look like a child who has eaten a jam tart. Joey comes from Joseph Grimaldi, an immensely popular English clown of the 19th century. His makeup was a white base with black eyebrows and red lips, with large red triangles on his cheeks that were supposed to imitate the look of a child who had been gorging on a jelly tart. In simple and limited stage lighting at the time, the clear marks on a white background made his facial expressions very clear, an important thing for Grimaldi, who had a very wide range of them. There have been since many variations on the Joey makeup clowns, and we were supposed to create their own personal look, but it had nothing to do with African stereotypes. Did you know that dentures were often made with teeth stolen from the battlefield? Teeth from dead people were a significant source of the tooth supply for dentists, who often didn't question exactly where they came from. Criminals and soldiers had the advantage that they mostly died young, and with their mouths in better states than people who died of natural causes, their teeth were especially prized. This helps to explain the acidity with the amounts of mouths of dead soldiers that were harvested in the aftermath of battles throughout this period, both by enterprising comrades of the dead and by camp followers who moved in immediately after the fighting ceased, just to take what they could from the deceased, and all too often, the still just alive as well. Did you know that duels often made accommodations for participants with disabilities? How could you expect to sword fight a challenger for your honor if you were missing an arm? Turns out the rules of dueling accounted for this. Duels were to be fights between equals, so if somebody challenged you to a duel, it would be their responsibility to make sure the fight was fair. It was considered proper by many dueling authorities to find ways to handicap the non-disabled challenger, to put them on equal grounds as possible. Basic examples that were followed here would include patching over the eye if the challenge party was missing one. More serious writers would go as far to contend that merely covering the eye was not sufficient, and that the challenger ought to have their own eye put out. The argument being that, although covered, knowing he nevertheless had a second eye created a disadvantage for the other man. While he couldn't afford to lose one, his opponent could. Just how extensively this was practiced in the late 15th to early 16th century was unclear, but it is generally unmentioned by the mid-16th century, and to be sure, other writers on honor and dueling considered it to be an absurd suggestion from the start. Other ways to bring about physical quality, which could be found in texts from the period, include weakening the challenger by forcing them fast prior to the fight, or by performing bloodletting. But this too started to die out by the early 1500s, leaving only temporary handicappings to be followed. Did you know that football was deadly until Teddy Roosevelt's time? College football was basically kill the man with the ball until the rules were changed in the early 1900s. User B's Dix notes, with death tolls of 18 in 1904 and 19 in 1905, the introduction of the forward pass in 1906 was one of the changes that made the game less dangerous because it resulted in players spreading out more on the field. President Theodore Roosevelt is often credited with encouraging the rule changes, as the History Channel explains. Football, however, was fatal, and even though Roosevelt acknowledged it required reform as it were to be saved, with his son Theodore Jr. now playing as a Harvard freshman, he had a paternal interest in reforming the game as well. Fresh from negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War, Roosevelt sought an end to the violence on the football field as well as the battlefield. Using his big stick, the first fan summoned the head coaches and representatives of the premier college powers, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, to the White House on October 9, 1905. Roosevelt urged them to curb the excessive violence and set an example of fair play for the rest of the country. The schools released a statement condemning brutality and pledging to keep the game clean. Did you know that Grimm's fairy tales weren't the original versions? Disney chose family-friendly storylines for their fairy tale movies, even though many of the stories have an older, more gruesome version in the Grimm Brothers collection. But the Grimm brothers weren't the only people who collected and told various fairy tales. The stories often predate their most famous written versions, and usually had multiple versions, some with happy and some with sad endings, before either Grimm or Disney got to them. They also weren't necessarily meant for kids. There's a lot of versions of Little Red Riding Hood where she dies and a lot of them where she lives. It kind of depends on where the stories are from and what point the society it came from is trying to impart to people. The purpose and meaning of a particular tale varies depending upon the author, storyteller, or collector, what they're trying to achieve with the tale, and who their audience is. Perrault was writing for the French aristocracy. The Brothers Grimm were, supposedly, attempting to collect the folklore of peasantry for scholastic purposes. No, children were not the original target audience of fairy tales. Children were often included in the audience, but they were not the primary audience. As such, these tales had lots of violence, lots of sex, lots of bawdy jokes and references, and lots of frank discussion about the issues that impacted the storytellers' worlds. For some context on when these stories might have been told, women often told such tales to each other while doing domestic work, chores, or other activities, or together with men around the fire after the children had gone to bed. Did you know that gunfights at high noon were almost non-existent in the Wild West? Gun violence was fairly common in the Wild West, but most of it was less dramatic than duels at high noon depicted in movies. More often or not, someone would shoot a different person during an argument, which is also a form of gun violence today. The prototypical Western shootout wasn't even fought in what most people consider when they conjure up an image of the Old West. Actually, the shootout between Wild Bill Hitchcock and Davis Toot in 1865 occurred in Springfield, Missouri. The two former friends had fallen out when Hitchcock lost his watch to Toot in the game. That was the last straw, telling Toot if he saw him wearing it, he was going to shoot him dead. Not one to back down from a tight, Toot did just that the next day, meeting Hitchcock in town, where they both drew and fired, Toot falling dead and Hitchcock unharmed. While it wasn't actually noon, this encounter nevertheless was what the legends were made of. It would only later serve as part of the aura surrounding as Wild Bill, but formed the basis of the entire concept of the quick draw showdown that still populates the Western genre today. Did you know that ancient honey in the Americas didn't come from honeybees? Honeybees are a European species, but we know that people in the Americas used honey in their food and drinks. The Mayans used it in a liquor called zabatun, for example, a ceremonial drink called balache, and a question on r/Ask Food Historians. User Planet NP reveals that people in what is now Mexico got their honey from a wasp species, and user Ignis Vespa adds that the Mayans used a native bee called Melipona beechi. As of now, there are plenty of organizations in the Yucatan Peninsula trying to bring back the consumption of Melipona honey, which is amazingly healthy and even used as medicine, but they're fighting deforestation, industrial pig farms, other bees, pesticides, and the Mennonites' illegal soy plantations. Did you know that in the United States there were some laws that kept women from being able to take out their own loans if they were married? If you've heard of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's role in fighting for the 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act, you might know a bit of this story. In some parts of the United States, married women couldn't even take out a loan without their husband co-signing. This rule was a holdover from the medieval European laws called coverture, which held that married or covered women didn't own property of their own, but shared it with their husbands. In the 1970s, some degree of coverture laws continued to apply in the United States, such as Louisiana, although very few of them. A series of Supreme Court decisions extended equal protection laws to marital status, which feminist legal scholars have considered to mark the final death of coverture. Louisiana's head and master law, which legally placed the husband in control of the marriage and marital assets, was finally abolished by the Supreme Court in 1981 in the case of Kirchberg versus Venstra. Did you know that most Civil War amputations were done under anesthesia? Thanks to the movies, most of us had the impression that battlefield surgery done in the Civil War era was brutally painful, but 95% of amputations were done with anesthesia. Reddit user Therabalin points out chloroform was the anesthetic of choice, and ether was also available, but that doesn't mean that these surgeries looked like modern-day ones. Only a low dose of anesthetic was used during the Civil War, just enough to make the patient insensitive to pain. Surgeons worked quickly and could complete a major operation within a matter of minutes. Many men moaned and moved about due to the agitating effects of a light dose of anesthetic. Some had to be held down by assistants, but they were unconscious and could not feel pain. Outside observers may have assumed that the men were being operated upon with no anesthetic, not understanding the groans and thrashing movements were caused by the chloroform or ether. These observations, combined with Civil War bullets found with pigs' teeth marks, have helped lend credence to the myth of biting the bullet. Did you know that Rome didn't exactly fall? The once grand Roman Empire became less grand over time, but user Schlin28 responds to a question about the fall of Rome saying, "But did Rome fall?" The answer is long and complicated, but here's a brief summary. The idea that Rome collapsed in fire and blood seems to be an enduring narrative in the popular imagination, but it is far less clear than it is the case amongst academic historians. The empire weakened significantly in the 5th century, particularly with the fall of North Africa to Vandals and the repeated failure of imperial expeditions to reconquer the region. But it did end with Roman liberties being trampled by barbarian soldiers? No, it did not. As Guy Hassall put it, Rome was not murdered, but it had instead accidentally committed suicide. No one, whether barbarian or Roman, had actually wanted to bring the empire down. They instead sought to improve their own positions within imperial structures, which often meant defeating the other people trying to do the exact same thing. Did you know sailors were worried about being protected from the sun? As sunscreen wasn't invented until modern times, how did pale-skinned sailors deal with it? It turns out they had several layers of protection. Reddit user Terminus Trantor points out that the ship's decks often had a tent or awning to protect the workers on the deck from the sun. And user J School Tiger noted long-sleeved and light-colored clothing was popular among the forerunner uniform or sailor suit. In addition, if sailors did get sunburn, there would be a variety of contemporary remedies, such as using grease, likely slush from the galleys, to cover the affected area, or soaking it with wet bandages. Most sailors working in the tropics likely developed a fairly deep tan over time, regardless of what protections they took from the sun. Did you know that the musket was a short-range weapon? Archers were able to shoot farther and with better accuracy than musketeers. They could also fire multiple arrows at the same time it took to load a single musket ball. So why did firearms dominate battles in their time? One of the big reasons is distance and accuracy didn't matter that much, since most of the fighting was done at a close range. In the end, the musket is not really significantly worse than the bow, nor is the bow really worse than the musket. The bow might have had a better rate of fire, but the musket is a much more powerful weapon. A skilled archer might have a greater range, but any person without enough strength to pull a bow is better fitted with a musket anyway. If you look outside of Europe, you'll find armies that kept using bows well into the 19th century because a cultural tradition of archery continued to exist, and thus ensured the existence pool of proficient archers. But this did not mean that they didn't use muskets. On the contrary, they used them in significant numbers and to great effect along with bows, with the latter proving short bursts of arrows, while the former provided more methodical and punishing fire. Did you know the silly illustrations in medieval manuscripts were intentionally made that way? Medieval illuminations range from serious to silly. You might assume that jousting snails and mooning monks were jokes inserted by the scribe who was getting away with something. But Reddit user Rhyme Royal tells us that they were often silly or distracting on purpose. Nearly every single page of a book has some kind of bizarre figure in the margins, ranging from knights dueling, snails, to disembodied heads with chicken legs to, well, you get the idea. A lot of money went into the Psalter and doodles, and they're deliberate. What purpose they serve is kind of an ongoing debate, since we don't have a blunt explanation about them. But because this is a religious text, one suggestion I've seen is there's supposed to be distractions that tempt you to look away from the sacred text and waste your time, quietly laughing at the buttholes. Do you know why we talk about 9 to 5 jobs and not 8 to 6 or 5 to 9? Well, the reason why we speak of full-time work as a 9 to 5 job, even though most jobs don't actually require those hours, as 8 to 5 is more common. Why did Dolly Parton sing about working 9 to 5? It turns out, Reddit user JB Dyer says, the phrase has been common for at least 100 years and often referred to as working hours for women or people in a low-stress, cushy office job. It wasn't a particularly common schedule. A 9 to 5 certainly did not describe a typical job, rather in some sense an ideal job. Did you know that women were once considered the sex-crazed gender? Today's trope of sex-obsessed men and prudish or uninterested women isn't universal throughout history. In early modern Europe, for example, it was women who were the voracious sexual creatures, according to user Mimic of Modes, as they explain. Another point is that early moderns understood the concept of the female orgasm and drew conclusions from it that we'd now consider bonkers. Some women had a shorter refractory period than men and were capable of multiple orgasms, and men's physicality was considered the norm. Women could be seen needing multiple partners in order to be fully satiated, though they'd be weaker vessels, yet they will overcome 2, 3, or 4 men in satisfying their carnal appetites. Thomas Wythorne, Elizabethan musician, tutor, wrote in the 16th century. By contrast, a man was capable of being satiated by a single woman, and indeed was pretty much always one and done. Well, there you have it, 22 historical facts that they might not teach you in school. Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe if you haven't already and hit that bell button, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.